Hey everyone, I'm Kelvin, and you're watching a special episode of Cloud and Fire during our normal weekly breakdown slot. Last week, Josiah and I each presented our position on Romans 11 and the question of who Paul had in mind when he speaks of all Israel. After those presentations, we kept the conversation going, and what followed turned into one of the most interesting parts of the entire discussion. So, this episode is a behind-the-scenes look at some of the real conversation, interaction, and key moments that came out of that exchange. Hope you enjoy it. Sorry, man. Where did I go wrong?
Well, all 3 points. No, I want to reiterate that I think that Romans chapter 11 is a very complex argument that Paul's making, and I do think that when you get to verse 26, the way that he says, "And in this way all Israel will be saved," there are different interpretations that I think are entirely valid and faithful to the text. Personally, as I was going back over this again last few days, there was a point where I was like, I can really see that view that it is talking about this elect group. But as I continued studying, as I read commentators, I think the fact that you begin at chapter 10 verse 1 and you go to the end of chapter 11, and the way that Paul is using the Israel and Gentile groups, he maintains this distinction between Jews and Gentiles, between Israel and Gentiles throughout that. And that was what most commentators were pointing out that I read, like just grammatically, linguistically, Paul everywhere else in those 2 chapters. In fact, kind of the point, what he's using, is Israel, the Old Testament people of God, being rejected by God? No. Yeah.
I believe that there is a distinction. I think it's more about the timing, I think, that the debate is on more than it is.
Well, yeah. Again, all the commentators I read, it was like you really have these 2 different...
Now, I'm not going to let you do that. Who are we looking at? Because Kelvin had more of my view on this topic in his commentary.
Yeah, he did.
But he also believed in a future Jewish conversion.
It's interesting, as I was Googling and Google's AI said that Calvin supported my view, and I was like, that doesn't seem right. So I read his commentary, and I was like, no, that's, he clearly doesn't interpret this that way. But he follows Augustine. He follows Augustine on that, which makes sense. If you've ever read Calvin's Institutes, he just is quoting Augustine all the time. But as I went through Barnes and Henry and Gill and the pulpit commentary,
so you're really picking a certain segment of commentary.
I was online on a Bible software, and I went through the expositor's commentary.
N.T. Wright was definitely more on my side.
N.T. Wright, that was something I mentioned.
Yeah.
N.T. Wright,
and he's Anglican, by the way.
He is. I actually don't. Yeah, I don't know what. Yeah, so there were definitely Chrysostom famously follows this Origin, although you don't really quote Origin for anything. But like a lot of things, Augustine is kind of an important commentator who, in some ways, breaks with some of the early fathers. Mm-hmm. I did find. One blog had a dozen quotes from early church fathers that was supporting more my view. So that it seemed like medieval church definitely favored your view.
Let's break that down a little bit, because there some of the ones that would favor your view, though, are mixed in with premillennialism.
There's going to be and it's also kind of anachronistic anytime we're talking about the categories that we have and how we're approaching
deflection, dude. Great debate tactic there, but yeah.
Well, and that's where a lot of the views, Piper, I read I think it was a sermon actually, but a transcription of a sermon that Piper had done, and he is favoring my view, but not from a post-millennial standpoint.
Right. Well, that's one of the things that I want to press. You did a great job explaining. I mean, your video or your presentation, I would say, was extremely well done. And the funny part is we both agree in a post-millennial eschatology. We've talked about like kind of the slight variation that I may be more pessimistic in my post-millennialism than you. But I thought you did a fantastic job in your argument. I think for me, though, it's really about what does Paul have on his mind?
Yeah.
And what is he viewing? I think that there's a force of your postmillennialism onto the text, and I don't think he has postmillennialism on his mind at all. I think he's talking and dealing with a culture of that time. Because remember, what is the actual importance of what he's talking about? Jew and Gentile relations. He's telling them to come together. Why would you tell the group then, don't look down upon these people because 2,000 or 3,000 years later, they're going to come to Christ? I think that that's a struggle for me to force on there as a postmillennialist.
Yeah.
For me, I'm thinking he has a much more immediate thought in developing that. And even as he says, and now the Jews or Israel has access to this.
Yeah, when you come to a passage with, I mean, and frankly, we always want truth, and so we're all, it's always important to try to understand the passage, but to a certain extent, either one of our interpretations is within the bounds of orthodoxy. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not pragmatically changing that much. Yeah. But whenever you come to a passage with what I would consider different plausible explanations, your systematic theology is going to shape how you interpret those difficult passages, I think. So for sure, that's part of it. And I've said even in my intro that, I think that this interpretation better fits not just the immediate context, but the overarching context of the New Testament story. I think if you start, though, in chapter 10, the beginning of chapter 10, and you read to the end of chapter 11, I think the narrative that Paul is telling us, that he's telling the Gentile Romans he's addressing here, this Israel, then the Gentiles, then Israel, overarching theme.
Well, now in my argument, I said we don't see the fulfillment and therefore push it out. Do you not see that as being something that your position is subject to, in that you're saying, well, I didn't see a mass conversion? Well, you're assuming a mass conversion. You're also assuming that after a hardening, that hardening would be released and that there would be this mass conversion. Whereas, truthfully, the union of the two into one is a strong, plausible argument. What do you see? Because you said let's go back to 10 and then follow it through. What are you seeing that makes you think that this is something that didn't occur and that would occur later?
So, number one, sometimes as I read this passage, because I'm really like, especially as I was reading it yesterday, I was like, maybe Kelvin's right. And
that's always a good way to start a thought.
And I was like, and then when I'm reading, and then I get to verse 26, I'm like, okay, I could definitely see in this way all Israel. You're saying all the elect from Jews and Gentiles. But then I kept reading, and I'm like, I think especially verse 28 hits me, but the overarching theme to me, just the sense that I'm getting is of this narrative that stretches from first Advent to second Advent. I think a lot of this hinges on the fullness of the Gentiles, which we did talk about last time. What is the fullness of the Gentiles? I'm interpreting that phrase in a way that is postmillennial. I think that it, not in a numbers way, but in the gospel has conquered the world. Paul has talked about the fact that the gospel has gone out to the world. An interpretive key there, are we saying that the gospel going out to the world is the same as the fullness of the Gentiles coming in? And that's where I would say no. I think the fullness of the Gentiles is referring to the nations being conquered for Christ. I guess, what does fullness of the Gentiles mean? right? What does that mean? What does the fullness of the Gentiles mean?
Your argument kind of hinges on that, and I'm going,
as far as the time goes,
well, yeah, because I think that it's a valid argument to say that the fullness of the Gentiles occurred in that time in the context of this passage, and it doesn't have to do with numbers. It has to do with it going to all the known world. He's saying that Jews are coming in during this period.
The idea that the Gentiles have been included by virtue of the Jews being partially hardened. So there's this hardening of the Jews that opens the door for the Gentiles. And when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in.
But you have to then justify the partial part. Does the partial mean a number, or does it mean...
Well, no, partial is the hardening. So
No, I said that, but what is the partial? Is the partial a number of Jews in contrast to the elect Jews or the remnant? Or is it a obstacle that's put in front of them? What is the partial?
I think another verse there, verse 12, is important. Chapter 11, verse 12. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? And again, just the way that is phrased, that seems to me to be a future someday. What is the full inclusion? I guess that would be...
That to me is the whole world having it, not the number of Gentiles coming in 2,000 years later, because the full inclusion means that all people groups outside of Israel are now in. So I have to touch all these areas. Go ahead.
But there, what will, how much more will their full inclusion mean?
Yeah, because it took this small group of people.
But there is the ethnic Jews. So I asked, did they stumble in order that they might fall? Right. By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Again, here's this idea that the Jews not accepting the Messiah has opened the door for the Gentiles. Now, if their trespass, there, again, is ethnic Jewish Israel.
Agreed. I'm not arguing
Now,
that.
if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? So what does full inclusion of ethnic national Israel mean?
Yeah, and so in my opinion, and I mean this respectfully, you have to extrapolate and create an entire eschatology around this to make this a future event in our future. And here's why. He's already laid out exactly what he's talking about, and it has to do with their trespass equals salvation to the Gentiles. The salvation of the Gentiles makes Israel jealous, and in 30 he says this is already happening. You could even think about it in terms of this. The assumption is that full inclusion is now a number.
And it's not about the numbers. It's not like 1,000,000 versus 100.
But it is. You either have numbers or manner. Full inclusion. It's either a mass group of people or it's a way in which they were brought in.
I see it more as a covenant status. The Jews have been, we've talked about this, divorced, right? But they're going to be reconciled again.
Okay, so now you have a big issue with Ken Gentry then. He doesn't say that they were just divorced. He says they had a death sentence for their adultery.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you would hold that in
I see. Yeah, obviously I'd have to talk to Ken about that. Again, this is about the flow of redemptive history for me. This is really all of redemptive history in 3 steps.
I just think you're anachronistically throwing on Paul a postmillennial view that I don't see that's not what he's discussing.
And all that.
Thanks, brother. That was a lot of fun. All right, let's go to the big finish. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching this special episode of Cloud and Fire. If you enjoyed the discussion, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know your thoughts in the comments, especially where you landed on Romans 11 and the question of who all Israel was. And don't forget, Cloud and Fire premieres every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and new episodes of the Weekly Breakdown drop every Thursday night right here on Kelvin's Faith Unfiltered. We'll see you next time.